verses that speak of Moses ascending Mount Nebo. Originally, we were going to sing this hymn, I'm Bound for the Promised Land, at the end of our service, arousing him to send us out. But then as Glenn and I were talking, we realized there's a little dilemma with singing that after we look at this text, because Moses is not bound for the Promised Land. Moses, who has led the people for all these years, is allowed to go up to Mount Nebo and see the Promised Land, but he will not enter with them. So hear these words from Deuteronomy 34. Then Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is, the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. The Lord said to him, This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over it. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. He was buried in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His sight was unimpaired and his vigor had not abated. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. Joshua, son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid his hands on him, and the Israelites obeyed him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, are there any grieving Wisconsin Badger fans out there this morning? Yes, Wisconsin came very close, but those young Kentucky Wildcats, they are something, aren't they? Well, as bad as the Wisconsin fans must be feeling this morning, I also feel very sorry for all the Florida Gator fans. As many of you know, the Florida Gators had quite a season. They had a remarkable run. They won 30 games in a row. They won the Southeast Conference and the tournament. And then they were the team that was favored to win the entire NCAA championship. They made it all the way to the Final Four, and then yesterday they lost to the Connecticut Huskies. And so many will remember this season for the Florida Gators as an epic season of greatness, where they achieved so many team records, won so many games, thrilled so many hearts in Gator Nation. But alas, tomorrow night, the Gators will be watching as two other teams play for what they had ultimately hoped. That chance to cut down the nets and say, we are the champions. Well, I wonder how the people of Israel felt for Moses as they prepared to enter the promised land without him. This poignant moment in Israel's history has touched me deeply since I first heard the story of Moses' life when I was a little boy in Sunday school. I can still remember seeing the picture in the book of Bible stories, the white-bearded Moses standing on top of Mount Nebo, wistfully gazing down across the verdant valleys, seeing the fruit-laden trees beside the flowing Jordan River. And even as a kid, I remember feeling sad for Moses. He had made it so far, leading the people of Israel in the desert for 40 long, hard years. But Moses was not going to get to enter the promised land. It seemed unfair. God would not allow Moses to enter the promised land because on one notable occasion, Moses had failed to follow God's instruction. Moses had been leading the people through the desert, and the people were thirsty. And at an earlier point in the wilderness journey, God had told Moses to strike a rock with his staff, and God would provide water from that rock. Well, a little later in the story, at another place, God tells Moses, as the people are again thirsty, to speak to a rock. To speak to the rock so that water would then gush forth for the people to drink. And in this account from Numbers 20, God gives this specific instruction to Moses not to strike the rock, to speak to the rock. And the text says that right after God tells Moses to speak to the rock, Moses gathered the people together along with Aaron and said, "Listen, you rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock for you?" And then the text says Moses slammed his staff against the rock, not once, but twice. And right there, God says to Moses, "Because you did not trust me, did not treat me with holy reverence in front of the people, you aren't going to lead these people into the land that I am giving them." God says, because you did not trust me or treat me with holy reverence in front of the people. I mean, who of us might not have lost our cool at that moment? These whiny, complaining people, once again, getting on our nerves, under our skin, and how easy it would have been just to maybe mishear those instructions and strike the rock. But the text indicates that God sees that Moses may not have been trusting God, and so he goes back to the old tried and true method of striking the rock rather than believing God's very word to speak to the rock. Plus the fact that Moses and Aaron say to the people, "Are we to get water from this rock for you rebels?" In other words, maybe taking some of the glory away from God and thinking that all of the responsibility fell on his shoulders. But again, who of us would not have felt the same way? Now, God does allow Moses to see the promised land, as we read at the end of Deuteronomy. And many commentaries and sermons have described this as God showing mercy to Moses, letting him see the beautiful land flowing with milk and honey. But to my way of thinking, getting to look in the land from the top of Mount Nebo still isn't enough. It doesn't jive with my sense of fairness. I mean, I respect that God is holy and that he calls us to obey his word. And I humbly accept that God's leaders are called to an even higher sense of obedience to God. And I understand that we are to give God the glory rather than taking credit for ourselves, as Moses and Aaron apparently were doing when they said, "Do we have to bring water out of this rock for you?" But I've always wished that God could have given Moses a mulligan on this one. After all, for 40 years, Moses has put up with all the grumbling, all the whining of the people. When their mothers and fathers were wanting to go back to Egypt, when their parents and aunts and uncles were worshiping the golden calf, Moses kept faithfully pointing them to God, reminding them of God's faithfulness. But this devoted servant of God can only picture what life in the promised land might be like, while a bunch of far less perfect folks get to cross the River Jordan and enjoy all the milk and honey. This story, it so reminds us that life doesn't always turn out the ways we hope. Yes, God wants us to experience blessing. But in a broken and fallen world, sometimes there are not happy endings. And often it's the case that things do not work out the way we hope. For how many of us have there been career aspirations? Something we worked so hard for, and it never quite materialized the way we had longed. Or the investments that we have carefully and in some ways generously set aside to help us and to give us an enjoyable retirement or to be able to pass on to our families. We see those investments evaporate due to economic circumstances or other circumstances beyond our control. For how many has a marriage that we went into expecting to be wonderful, to grow old with that person? It ended far too soon, not as we would have wished. Or an illness struck us down and prohibited us from enjoying the kind of life that we really wanted to. Or in how many of our lives has death devastated our hopes and our plans? I think one of the reasons that even as a kid I was haunted by this story, and I think in a very significant way a lot of us find our hearts resonating with the picture of Moses up on Mount Nebo looking over into the promised land, is because we all realize this can happen to us. That the very thing that we think we have longed for, we may not be able to realize. My lifelong tension with this story took a turn a few years ago at one of my retreats at the Transforming Center, as I listened to Ruth Haley Barton offer a message on this very text about Moses on Mount Nebo. And as she faced the story of Moses climbing the mountain to view the promised land on the plain below, Barton was struck by the fact that there is no evidence of an inner struggle in Moses, no indication that Moses argued with God. Unless we think that might just be a detail that the author left out of the text, we have to remember that throughout the long story of Moses, we do see many times where Moses argues with God. They had such a real relationship that Moses would often pour out his heart to God. But here, there is no inner struggle. There is no turmoil. And Barton observes they had been through so much together, God and Moses, that maybe now it was just enough to sit and rock on the front porch of life, each one content just to know that the other is there. That was all it took. to make life good. And as I listened to her say these words, putting some new light on this text, I began thinking about my own life, the unfinished business, unfulfilled dreams and longings never to be realized. And the awareness hit me. In the end, for Moses, the promised land is not a place. For Moses, the presence of God was the promised land. Oh yes, Moses would soon be going to a far greater promised land than Canaan. We sang about that this morning, how yes, as Christians, we are on that journey to the ultimate promised land. But the Christian hope is not just about a pie-in-the-sky promise of another existence after we leave this vale of tears. Our hope includes the promise that the Lord is with us now. Our promise, our hope is that God invites us to know Him, to abide in Him. And as we grow in that relationship, it puts a holy perspective on all of the other longings in life. Could it be that the promised land is less about a physical destination or anything that is outward and more about a life that enables us to worship and love God fully? Is it possible for us to have encountered God so wonderfully that no matter what we are working for here on earth, we know we already have what we most deeply want? The presence of God that can never be taken away from us. In one of those idyllic moments in life, 4 years ago, I stood on a rocky beach in the English coastal town of Brixham. A few feet from where I stood was an historic plaque that indicated that near this spot in 1847, the Reverend Henry Francis Light composed the well-known hymn, "Abide with Me." It's always been one of my favorite hymns. It's a beautiful text. And the story goes that in 1844, Henry Francis Light, who was a minister at the All Souls Church where he had served for 23 years there in that little seaside town of Brixham, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis, and his health increasingly deteriorated over the next few years. And on September the 4th, 1847, Reverend Light stood in that pulpit for the last time, giving his farewell sermon to these people that he had loved for 23 years. And that afternoon, he stood on that same rocky beach, and as the sun sparkled on the water of the bay and the evening shadows began to fall, Henry Francis Light wrote this prayer: "Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me." Of course, it references Jesus in his farewell discourse to the disciples, the Last Supper, from John 15, saying, "Abide in me. Apart from me, you can do nothing." And I believe, knowing a little bit about Henry Francis Light's life and ministry, that poem he composed was not a desperate prayer of a dying man. but it was an affirmation of faith from one whom God had cultivated a relationship that grew deeper and more wonderful with each passing day, and so that as he saw the evening shadows falling on his own life, it was only real for him to say, thank you, that through cloud and sunshine, you abide with me. And so thanks be to God. This final chapter of Moses' earthly story that had puzzled and frustrated me for years, it has now become one of the biblical pictures that I most treasure. Moses and God together at the top of Mount Nebo, seeing life, considering life, treasuring the life that is and the life that is to come with that eternal perspective. Every time I read about Moses' relationship with God, says Ruth Barton, I am filled with longing. And it's not the longing to get somewhere, it's the longing to be a certain kind of person, a person who knows God, a person through whom God can perform whatever deeds need to be done, mighty or otherwise, but also a person who can be just as content settling down beside a well or sitting on the side of a mountain in God's presence, someone whose face shines because she has been talking to God, someone whose every move is a result of an attempt to listen to God and then do what he says, someone who, when God says, it's time to let go, it's time for you to come home, easily lets go and rests in the arms of this one whom she has grown to love and trust with her very being. Trusting Christ with our very being. Knowing Christ, that's the goal. That's the promised land. And so no matter where life takes us, wherever we go or do not get to go, may we always abide in life and in death in the promised land of God's very presence. Amen.